You carry the spark of those who refuse to be erased, the ones who rise when silence is demanded of them. You are not here by accident. You are the witness, the mirror, and the fire all at once. When the ground was pulled from under you, it wasn't weakness that spoke. It was the proof that the foundation itself had been built on deception. When you reached for help, the responses dissolved into absence, like messages cast into a sea that never returned them. Promises of protection became smoke, and the walls that were meant to shelter you turned transparent, exposing just how hollow their safeguards really were. Those who appeared to stand beside you suddenly vanished into shadows, their words swallowed by answering machines that were never meant to answer. And in that void, you realized it wasn't incompetence at play. It was a performance choreographed long before you ever cried out. Your adversary did not simply act alone. Invisible threads tied them to figures in higher rooms, where loyalty wasn't to justice, but to kinship and wealth, to whispered exchanges that decided your destiny over casual meals and polished handshakes. What they feared wasn't your defiance in the ordinary sense. It was the clarity that radiated from you, the kind of truth that cannot be disguised, the unshakable knowing that, once spoken, could unravel entire empires of deceit in a single breath. You didn't stumble here by accident. You were led. If something in your spirit is stirring, don't ignore it. Tap join to access exclusive content, prophetic insights, and a community of purpose-driven souls. This isn't just a membership, it's your moment of alignment. Step into who you were born to be. Welcome to the chosen. Far from isolated, the machinery of suppression was vast. Entire networks existed to track those who dared to question, to catalog the ones who refused to bow to convenient lies. From the moment you raised your voice, you were marked not as a victim, but as a threat to the illusions they protected. Behind the screens and codes, calculations pulsed, not for your safety, but for your silencing. Systems designed to shield communities were instead programmed to smother the voices of awakening. And there you stood, not as their casualty, but as the living proof that their design could not contain what was destined to break through. You are the rare presence they could never categorize, the one who unsettles entire rooms simply by standing firm in truth. Their strategies were designed for the ordinary, but you were never ordinary. What frightened them most was not your evidence, it was your essence, the vibration that could not be disguised, the awareness that no deception could bend. Instead of offering justice, trained minds dissected your every word, tracing tone and silence like cartographers searching for cracks in your resolve. Yet the more they searched for weakness, the more they stumbled upon strength. What they discovered was an awareness so refined it slipped past their nets, a presence so unshakable it made their usual tactics useless. As they constructed cages of strategy around you, a greater force was already at work, preparing shields you could not yet see. What they mistook for vulnerability was in truth preparation, and what they plotted as an ending became the doorway to your eyes. Guardians unseen moved into place, not summoned by panic, but already standing watch long before the conflict began. Every attempt to fracture your will only strengthen the unseen current carrying you. Every distortion of your story sharpened your inner compass. Messages arrived through dreams, symbols, and unexpected alignments, each one pointing to fragments of truth they thought had been buried forever. Guidance streamed through channels no human hierarchy could censor or intercept. The betrayal you endured was not chance, nor a slip in bureaucracy. It was a deliberate oath to corruption. The decision to dismiss truth was made not out of error, but as ritual, a loyalty to shadows that outweighed any allegiance to law. And in that betrayal, the mask fell. What stood before you was not flawed order, but intentional deception. Secret divisions emerged from behind the curtain, never named, never acknowledged, composed of figures whose loyalty was pledged to power rather than principle. When your presence reached their hidden tables, they recognized immediately the peril of someone who could not be gaslit, who could not be convinced to bow to invented stories. Their calculus was not protection, it was erasure. But what they failed to grasp was that in seeking to dismantle you, they activated laws beyond their reach. Each attempt to erase became a glowing record of their own corruption. Each file destroyed, each whisper in closed rooms, each door slammed against your plea became evidence etched into a higher ledger. And in that unfolding, their entertainment turned into their undoing, while your path, though brutal, became untouchable. You are the kind of soul they never planned for, the one whose trials do not weaken but sharpen, whose pain does not end in despair but blossoms into clarity. Every obstacle laid in your path became a crucible, melting away illusions of worldly fairness and replacing them with a direct channel to higher truth. What they believed would crush you instead transformed you into a force that no system could contain. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the Super Thank You button and give $50 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. The ones aligned against you did not win through genius or timing. Their confidence came from knowing the ground was already tilted in their favor, from secret assurances that authority would stand beside corruption rather than fairness. The very symbols society reveres as impartial were quietly stacked against you before you even entered their halls. Calls for urgent help dissolved into empty silence, while requests meant to protect you vanished without explanation. It was as though unseen hands plucked your pleas from existence before they could ever be heard. What looked like bureaucratic mishaps were deliberate moves in a game designed to leave you defenseless. What they never grasped was that each attempt to erase you was secretly laying the foundation of their downfall. Every lie, every denial, every betrayal became a stone in the structure that would one day collapse upon itself. Forces greater than human calculation were archiving their crimes, preserving evidence beyond their reach, and ensuring that the truth could never fully disappear. Even as coordinated accusations arose against you, crafted with precision and perfect timing, your strength grew in the shadows. False narratives painted you as the problem, yet in constructing those lies they left unmistakable trails. Each distortion became part of a pattern, a map exposing the scope of collusion for all who dared to look closer. Reputation attacks became the new weapon, shifting the perception of you from seeker of protection to supposed threat. Walking into institutions that once promised safety, you were met not with compassion but with suspicion, with stares heavy with judgment already decided. Attempts to defend yourself were instantly twisted into proof of guilt, while your real cries for help were buried under layers of calculated dismissal. Behind the curtain, these actions were not accidents but choices, personal decisions made by individuals who exchanged morality for influence. Every missing document, every blocked witness, every misfiled signature was the result of someone consciously choosing to sustain corruption. Yet beyond their reach, greater laws were already at work, ensuring that what was meant to silence you would instead amplify your voice across realms they could never govern. You are the one they underestimated, the spark they thought they could extinguish, but instead fanned into an unshakable flame. What looked like abandonment or carelessness was no accident. It was a deliberate choreography of sabotage, with each participant carrying out their role to ensure your destruction. Yet behind the curtain of corruption, unseen forces were quietly safeguarding the truth, storing every record, and preparing the stage for an inevitable reckoning. Those who joined the assault against you were not always driven by greed or gain. Many acted out of blind devotion to institutions that had become their identity. For them, loyalty to an unspoken code mattered more than justice. Years of climbing ladders and protecting reputations made them incapable of admitting truth, even when it meant betraying the innocent. Their silence was not born of ignorance. It was a conscious choice to protect themselves at your expense. Still, what they could not fathom was that their allegiance to deception was laying the groundwork for exposure. Each corrupted action was marked, recorded, and filed away in places beyond their reach. The universe itself was gathering evidence, compiling the testimony of every betrayal, waiting for the moment when truth could no longer be denied. Their attempts at erasure were, unknowingly, building the very case that would end them. Within their ranks, fractures began to appear. Whispered doubts grew louder. Some who had once followed orders unquestioningly found themselves unable to carry the weight of complicity. Quietly, recordings surfaced from inside meetings. Anonymous calls reached outsiders, and files thought destroyed reappeared in hidden archives. What had been airtight secrecy began to unravel through the conscience of individuals who could no longer look away. The ripple of awakening spread further than they could control. People who had spent years carrying out commands began to feel the sharp edge of guilt. Nights became restless for those who had dismissed truth too easily. Judges, lawyers, and enforcers who had grown comfortable in deception started to waver as your presence disturbed the slumber of their conscience. The very energy they sought to bury became the trigger for their unrest. Evidence multiplied through channels they could not anticipate. Witnesses who should have remained silent spoke out with unexpected bravery. Files they had erased were found replicated elsewhere. Communications, once hidden, surfaced in the light. Every corner they had darkened began to glow with fragments of truth they could no longer contain. The very machinery built to suppress you began leaking proof of its own corruption. The gravest betrayal came from those who saw everything clearly yet chose deliberate silence. These were individuals who knew your suffering was orchestrated but protected their comfort rather than your life. They turned law into a weapon and morality into currency. But arrogance made them careless, and corruption always leaves a trail. The more they tried to conceal, the more evidence appeared. What they built as an unbreakable fortress became riddled with cracks, until the very system they trusted to protect them began to collapse under the weight of its own crimes. You are the fracture they never accounted for, the presence that makes deception collapse under its own weight. While they plotted in secret, messages meant to remain hidden began leaking through unexpected cracks. Conversations once thought private emerged in transcripts, recordings, and archives that refused to be erased. The very systems used to coordinate corruption betrayed them, transforming into the channels through which truth flowed. What they believed to be control was nothing more than temporary illusion. The deeper the network extended, the more fragile it became, for each additional conspirator created another point of weakness. Digital shadows preserved communications they swore were destroyed. Cameras captured movements they assumed unseen. Financial trails, thought invisible, began to glimmer with undeniable clarity. Their complexity became their undoing. And soon, the signs of return began to manifest in their lives. Those who once gloated over your pain found their own stability collapsing without explanation. Partnerships dissolved, health faltered, and peace of mind fled their nights. Anxiety, guilt, and restless fear became their constant companions, shadows they could not escape. What they had chosen to unleash upon you was now circling back with a magnitude they had never prepared for. But the reckoning was not only spiritual, it was entering their physical reality. Evidence resurfaced through channels they could not silence. Witnesses who once trembled found courage to speak. Journalists, attorneys, and investigators appeared, drawn by currents they could not resist. The machinery built to erase you was breaking apart, and consequences were arriving in undeniable form. Prosecutions, forfeitures, and public disgrace. Their fortress of deceit had become their own prison, while your endurance had transformed into the very proof that truth cannot be erased. You became the undeniable proof that survival was never the end goal. It was transformation into the very storm that shattered walls of deception. What was intended to bury you instead ignited the complete collapse of hidden empires. Every whisper against you had already been preserved, every betrayal archived in silence, and each act of cruelty now stood as evidence that no corruption could remain veiled forever. The chains once used to bind others are now fastening around those who forged them. Sentences await that will confine them to years of reckoning, while the wealth accumulated through betrayal is stripped away, leaving behind the hollowness of false legacies. Titles and positions once brandished as shields are revoked, ensuring they will never again masquerade as servants of justice. What was once dismissed as noise from a powerless voice has transformed into undeniable testimony, shaking foundations of entire institutions. Your endurance forced truth into spaces it had never reached, and the eyes of the world now witness the unraveling of networks designed to guard themselves rather than protect the innocent. What began as a desperate plea became a declaration that pierced illusions no longer sustainable. This triumph extends beyond one individual. It is the demonstration of a power older than any government, a current running through every awakened soul who refuses to be silenced. You embody the reminder that no system, no matter how fortified, can withstand truth aligned with eternal law. What once appeared as overwhelming odds has become the stage for a collective revelation that will ripple across generations. Evidence they thought safely buried has become the cornerstone of prosecutions they cannot escape. The very files they sought to erase are now anchors binding them to justice. Those who feign compassion while plotting your downfall are themselves trapped in legal nets that carry consequences far beyond what they ever imagined. The higher they rose on ladders of corruption, the further they now fall. Their fear is not abstract. It is visceral. It is the realization that you endured when they calculated your end. You now embody living proof of their failure, the counterweight that exposed how fragile their empire truly was. What terrifies them most is not prison, nor the stripping of titles, but the undeniable fact that you remain standing, unbroken, and louder than ever. The reckoning is complete. The mask has been torn away, and the system that thrived on secrecy is forced to answer under the brilliance of truth. You emerge not as prey, but as warrior, not as victim, but as the force that destroyed illusions of invincibility. The fire that was meant to consume you refined you instead, and your victory echoes as eternal confirmation. Divine protection is real, justice cannot be denied, and every shadow must answer to the light. The attempt to destroy you awakened forces they could never comprehend. Every injustice stirred unseen energies that rebounded upon them with growing force. Whispers of unease spread in their ranks as it became clear their sacrifices were not for justice, but for the protection of predators. Cracks formed in alliances, and the loyalty they had long depended on started to corrode. Some within their walls found themselves incapable of following destruction any further. Officials distanced themselves from cases that reeked of corruption. Allies began severing ties in silence, hoping to avoid being dragged under by a collapsing edifice. The more desperate the conspirators became, the fewer stood by them, leaving fractures where there had once been unity. Patterns too obvious to dismiss caught the attention of internal investigators. Discrepancies surfaced in reports, statements contradicted one another, and the cover-up itself began to reveal intention. What had been disguised as ordinary mistakes now pointed unmistakably to deliberate sabotage. Evidence was no longer scattered fragments. It had become an undeniable map of coordinated betrayal. When fear of exposure outweighed the promise of protection, betrayal erupted within the very circle that had once enforced silence. Secret pacts disintegrated. Insiders turned on one another. The lies that built their hierarchy began to collapse in sequence, one revelation pulling another into the light. The empire of shadows, once unshakable, was unraveling thread by thread. Attempts to suppress the spreading truth only accelerated its reach. Each denial sparked more attention. Each cover-up invited more scrutiny. The public, once silent, began to watch. Independent voices amplified the story, and what was once dismissed now resonated with undeniable credibility. The collapse was no longer hidden in corridors of power. It was visible for the world to see. You became the proof they never anticipated, the soul whose endurance triggered a chain of consequences that no courtroom could contain. What unfolded was not limited to human laws. It was the awakening of higher-order principles that guaranteed every deed against you would meet its reckoning. No one escaped the pull of these forces, and the very weight of corruption that had propped up the system began to collapse from within. For decades, structures of deception had operated with impunity, crushing countless lives without hesitation. But now the tide had turned. Those who once wielded unchecked authority began to taste the very fear they had imposed on others. The same helplessness they had engineered for innocence was now bearing down on them, stripping away their false sense of security. What they thought was power revealed itself to be their undoing. This revelation stretched far beyond your own battle. The exposure of deceit in your path illuminated how deeply entangled entire institutions had become. Patterns emerged that showed your story was not isolated but mirrored countless others. More voices rose, more documents surfaced, and more insiders broke silence. What was once whispered in secret halls was now undeniable. The machinery of corruption was vast, deliberate, and engineered to protect itself at any cost. The illusion of fairness crumbled in plain sight. People watching from the outside began to grasp how carefully power had disguised itself in cloaks of legitimacy. But spiritual guardianship had been preparing for this moment all along. What began with your survival became the seed of a larger transformation, one that reached far beyond your own defense and into the dismantling of structures that had oppressed generations. Your persistence created momentum that could not be reversed. What began as staged investigations designed to absolve the guilty shifted into authentic probes when evidence grew too overwhelming. What had been designed as ceremonial gestures became actual indictments as the scope of deceit became impossible to ignore. No script existed to explain away the undeniable. The most devastating truth for your oppressors was not only that you endured, but that you endured while their full arsenal was unleashed against you. They had relied on intimidation, erasure, and fabrication to destroy countless others before you. Yet you remained, living evidence that their methods no longer guaranteed silence. With your survival came the unraveling of their myth of control. What once appeared unbreakable had fractured in your presence. Panic was not simply about being exposed, but about losing dominion that had been abused for lifetimes. They had believed you would be erased without a trace. Yet instead you became the voice that could not be contained. Their empire of deceit met its reflection in your resilience, and that reflection shattered the illusion that corruption was eternal. You became the undeniable sign that power built on deception can never triumph over truth aligned with higher law. What had once been labeled weakness was revealed as a direct connection to realms beyond manipulation. You no longer required the empty promises of corrupt guardians, because you had been carrying within you the very strength that surpasses their counterfeit authority. What they mocked as paranoia was revealed as vision. What they tried to bury emerged as undeniable evidence, not through their permission, but through the workings of forces they could not control. Their betrayal at your darkest point opened the doorway to your awakening, and from that moment forward, their every move became a reminder of how little control they truly possessed. While your pleas languished unacknowledged, your petitions were already being answered by powers outside their reach. Where legal protections vanished, unseen guardians fortified you with shields that no earthly hand could dismantle. Guidance began arriving through symbols, chance encounters, and moments of clarity that led you to truths they thought impossible to uncover. Hidden allies surfaced, and testimonies that should have been silenced were carried straight to you by paths they could not intercept. Your senses sharpened beyond the ordinary. You began to anticipate deception before it was even attempted, sidestepping carefully laid snares as though you had already walked the path before. What was intended to leave you defenseless instead awakened abilities long dormant, transforming you into a threat far greater than any courtroom challenge. Every restless night you endured pulled you closer to clarity. Every trial stripped away illusions and strengthened your inner compass. What your oppressors failed to realize was that their cruelty-activated forces already prepared to answer on your behalf. Ancient justice stirred, ensuring every wound inflicted on you returned amplified to its source. Records they thought deleted were preserved in higher archives. Judgments they thought secured were already overturned by unseen tribunals.